Hi everyone! In this tutorial, you're going to learn how to set up your own reusable fluid spacing and typography framework for your Bricks Builder projects. It's gonna be simple, effective, and it's gonna cost you $0 forever. You will also learn how to work with the CSS variables as well as global classes in Bricks Builder because both can be considered as a constituent part of that very framework. Let me briefly demonstrate what fluid spacing and typography actually is and what are the advantages over traditional breakpoint methods. I have prepared two cards side by side that contain some basic elements. The left card doesn't use so-called fluid spacing and typography, while the right one does. If I go through the responsive breakpoints, you can notice that both typography and spacing remains more or less identical for both of the cards. However, there's a major difference between them. If I selected any element from the left card, the dot above the responsive breakpoints indicates that a certain change has been made to that very element. In this case, it can either be the font size or a padding or margin. Each and every element had to be updated in some way in order to catch up with the right card elements. But if I selected any element in the right-hand side card, you'll find none of them have been updated in any way. However, it all scales down perfectly fine due to its fluidity. Maybe the best way to depict a difference is to simply resize the browser window. I believe that anyone can come to the conclusion that instead of relying on fixed values that change abruptly at predetermined screen sizes, fluid spacing and typography smoothly scale elements, creating a seamless viewing experience across any viewport size. That approach not only improves the workflow, but the fluid nature of these systems reduces the need for excessive media queries and manual adjustments, tremendously saving your time and effort. The very first constituent part of our framework are the CSS variables. They are the base of it. Bricks Builder allows you to define your CSS variables by using its global classes and variables manager. In case you're not familiar with the CSS, do not despair, it'll all be about a copy-paste and a common sense. There's a website that provides us with a free typography and spacing calculator, and the site is named Utopia, utopia.fyi. It'll do for us the hard math that's hidden behind fluidity calculations. All we need to know prior to generating required values are three simple steps, three simple things. Minimum viewport and typography size, maximum viewport and typography size, and the scaling factor. Viewport sizes are usually 320 and 1440 pixels respectively. However, the latter one is up to your Bricks Builder content width preference. Typography size should be at least 16 pixels for mobile devices and between 80 and 20 for desktop. My own content width is 1440 pixels, it's set in Bricks Builder, so I'll use that one as a max viewport width. The third one, named type scale, represents a ratio to generate a series of CSS values which smoothly scale the font sizes and spacings between your specified minimum and maximum viewport widths. Available ratios are derived from established typographic principles such as the golden ratio and other musical intervals, and they help us create visually balanced type or spacing systems. The higher the type scale, the more dramatic the scaling. That's the rule here. I prefer the major third, and that's the reason I've put the major third into the equation. If I now scroll down to the page bottom, I can find generated CSS variables that will define my fluid typography. Let's now see what's been generated for the fluid spacing. By default, only individual values and single-step pairs are generated, but I also added double-step pairs. I did it because quite often you need a more dramatic size decrease between the max and min viewport size. It's not a must, however, I have personally found it very useful. I think no further explanation regarding the individual, single-step or double pairs are needed. The illustrations on the side should speak for themselves. So at the bottom of the page, you're going to be able to find generated CSS variables that will define our fluid spacing. Let's get back to Bricks Builder, where I have prepared some sort of styles preview page. On this page, you can find most of the basic Bricks Builder elements, from headings, body text, buttons, navigation, form, and also a few elements that require padding or spacing, such as text cards. But we'll come to that part a little bit later. As you can tell, everything is completely unstyled. In this step, we'll make use of our CSS variables generated by Utopia's Fluid Calculator. First, I'm going to open Global Classes and Variables Manager, hit the second icon next to the Bricks Builder logo in the upper left corner. After that, I'll choose to import CSS variables rather than creating them one by one. Now I'll get back to Utopia's calculator and copy-paste both typography and spacing CSS variables. Do not copy the root pseudo class nor any of the curly braces. You should only copy what's found between the curly braces. The same goes for the spacing and CSS variables. Select between the curly braces, copy and paste on a new line of the import variables input field. Once done, click on Import CSS Variables below and hit the Save button. Even though it's not necessary nor it'll have any performance impact, you might want to categorize your CSS variables. Personally, I like to keep things organized, and that's why I created two categories, typography and spacing. That allows me to separate or group my CSS variables in a more appropriate manner. Now that I have my variables imported, it's time to define typography and spacing on a global level. I have to stress that all I'm doing here is a constituent part of our Fluid framework. I'll choose Settings by hitting the cog icon and then Theme Styles. This is the place in Bricks Builder where you can globally style up almost any building block or element, so that each instance of that element you put on the stage is already tailored to your needs. So let's start with typography. I have to define a body text for which I'm going to use var step 0, one of my typography CSS variables. I just have to type in step or click on that icon. You can also add the text color, line height, or anything else you think that might belong to the global setting. Likewise, I'll add the color to all of my headings and maybe reduce the letter spacing, but not the size. Why? Because each heading should have its own size, which is defined per heading tag. So H1 should have a size of step 5 or step 5, and also reduce line height. I use 1.1 EM for H1, H2 and H3. The H2 should have a size of step 4 or step 4 and a reduced line height of 1.1 EM. H3 element should have a size of step 3 or step 3 and a reduced line height of 1.1. And so on, all the way down to the H6 heading element, whose size is going to be step 0 or step 0, and its line height will be a little bit more, like 1.4 EM, and I'll make it a little bit bolder. Let's now try to manage our buttons, because buttons also use some padding around the text, and that padding should also be fluid, just like the button typography itself. So the point is to go through the theme style elements and replace the full typography size with our fluid type scale, as well as all the margins, paddings, maybe widths, heights, positions with our fluid spacing. For instance, if I open the section panel, I could add left and right padding so that the content placed inside the section is always secluded from the viewport edges, and it's going to be fluid as well. I could also set both typography and spacing of the form element in order to make the forms fluid as well. Of course, you will not have to set up elements that you don't plan to use. So if you never use the form element or, I don't know, counter element, just leave it unstyled. There's quite a lot of work here, but once you complete it, it can be reused over and over with each new project you start in the future, because Bricks Builder allows you to export and import theme styles. I'll show you how exactly in the end of this tutorial. If you ever need to change something, these changes will most likely be minor only. You'll never need to start from scratch. Due to the fact that this video might take a significant amount of time if I continue to set everything up before your eyes, I'll have to fast forward this part and land to the very end of this chapter. So once we have everything ready, it's time to move on to the last part of this tutorial, which is the global CSS classes. At this point, we could deploy our CSS variables wherever the font size property is required, or the padding, margin, width, height, position, CSS transformation, Generally speaking, any CSS property that is meant to be expressed in an official CSS unit. For example, if I scroll down to the card section, I could set the first card padding to space L2XL, var space L2XL. What exactly does it mean? It means that the padding size will be interpolated. It'll start as 2XL for the viewport size 1440 pixels and above, and end up as an L size for all the viewports having a width of 320 pixels. Everything in between 1440 and 320 pixels is not of your concern. It'll be calculated automatically. That's the reason you do not need breakpoints, okay? However, there's a big disadvantage of using the CSS variables only approach. You will actually have to edit the padding of each instance of the text card site-wide if you want them all to use identical padding. And that might become a real nightmare when the client asks for a smaller top padding of all text cards. Imagine how it's like to update 20 text cards scattered across multiple pages. And that's where the power of global classes steps in. If you didn't notice yet, I already put some class names below certain elements on Styles Preview page. For instance, below the heading extra large, I've placed the class name TextXL. Let's say I plan to use an XL text size on more than just one page of my website. In order to avoid the aforementioned nightmare regarding the site-wide updates, I will simply create a new global class named TextXL. What I need to do is to enter the class name without the dot notation into the class input field and hit enter on the keyboard. And that's how you add a new global class in BricsBuilder. As long as the class name remains highlighted, I can edit almost any BricsBuilder available property of the target element, not just typography. In this case, I'll add the font size and line height. Font size will be space XL2XL, var space XL2XL, and the line height will be 1.1 em. I explained a moment ago what that L and XL part of the CSS variable actually is. Once I'm done editing my global class, I'll simply hit an X icon next to the class name in order to cease the editing. You should never forget to do that, otherwise you might end up adding more properties to the class by accident. If I now scroll down to the card section, I can create the global class for each and every one of them so that each text card has its own class. A different class name defines different padding value. So how exactly using global classes affects the aforementioned nightmare when it comes to the site-wide updates? Well, you can think of the global class as a central repository of one or more CSS properties being assigned to it, and which relate to the target element, of course. If you update the global class, you update all the element instances which use that very class, site-wide. Let's say that the hero text, this is my hero text, should be extra large on just one of my website pages. I'll simply select the hero text on stage in the first place, then bring the cursor inside the class input, and finally either search for a specific class or just pick it up from the list. At the end, I'll remove the focus from the class editing because I just wanted to apply the class to the hero text. But if I wanted to edit the class and, for example, update the color of all extra large text site-wide, I can do that by highlighting the target class name and editing the text color. You can see that both instances of an extra large text get updated instantly. Even though they are on the same page, the change would have happened site-wide across all the pages even if I had thousands of them. And that's the advantage of using global classes over using CSS variables. One update rules them all. So my next step is to create different classes for all the elements I have on this page. Because of the fact that it would be a time-consuming process, I'll fast forward again and land to the point where everything is ready. As you can see, my Styles Preview page now looks completely different than when I started. I've gone throughout many BricsBuilder elements using the theme styles and applied our CSS variables wherever I plan to. I also created a lot of global classes, much more than I needed to, just in case. So all the global classes utilize pretty much intuitive names, so it shouldn't be that hard to figure out what a particular class is meant to be used for. Some of the classes include the custom CSS code, which is also allowed and sometimes even crucial. For every one of you that doesn't want to bother with starting from scratch, for a small fee I have prepared a download file which contains everything you need to quick start. In that file, you can find importable theme styles, CSS variables, global classes, the styles preview page itself, and even the color palette. So what you're gonna have is a fully functional, fluid typography and spacing framework ready to be used with your next project. Before I end this tutorial, there are two things I want to go through. The first one is a brief demonstration of how to work with global classes and variables. At the bottom of my styles preview page is a feature card that I intentionally left unstyled so that I can show you how much easier your life as a developer can be if you had a system or framework. First of all, I'll add some space atop the feature block. Instead of going to the layout panel and adding either a margin or padding, I'll simply choose a global class. I'm going to add a 2XL 4XL space atop the block. So the class name I need is space T 4XL. That class already includes the 2 steps down spacing for the smallest viewport size in the definition. You can inspect all the class properties if you highlight the class name. I already mentioned it. So in this case, the chosen class only includes the fluid top margin value, which is expressed via the CSS variable. Var space 2XL 4XL. Okay. The above heading of the tagline is going to use a different class. I want to use text uppercase spaced, and I'll just type in text into the search so that all classes which relate to the keyword text show up. Yet again, if you want to inspect those very class properties or need to change something, be sure the class is being highlighted. Otherwise, be sure to shut it down in order to not to change something by accident, because if you do that, the accidental change shall propagate site-wide. The heading itself and the text below seem to be okay, so now we'll handle the spacing between elements. I can do that by adding one of the gap clauses directly to the text wrapper element, and if I do that, all the elements will be evenly spaced apart from each other. But I can also add one of the spacing clauses to each element individually and thus group elements more visually, which allows more control over the spacing, but on the other hand, it'll be more time taxing. And there's a third option too. You can also add one of the gap clauses and then additionally adjust spacing by adding one of the spacing clauses to a particular element. So you really have plenty of options. My next step is to add a background to the text wrapper, for which I don't really need a special class. I'll just pick the color from my color palette. And finally, let's center the text vertically inside the wrapper and add some space around the text. For that purpose, I can use one of the cards classes, which adds equal amount of padding to each side, horizontally and vertically. So let's add a 2XL card size, XXL. So I just type in card keyword and all the card classes show up below. And that's it responsiveness wise. I'm briefly going to check my feature block through the breakpoints to see if everything is alright. As you can tell, no adjustment is needed, all typography is properly scaled down, as well as the spacing, and I probably saved at least 20 minutes here, right, on editing this feature block. The second thing that I want to add before the end is how to, quote-unquote, teleport your framework from one project to another. With Bricks Builder, you can export everything. Apart from templates, you can export theme styles, CSS variables and global classes, and even the color palette if you want to. So if you're about to export theme styles, hit the settings button in the upper left corner, choose theme styles, click the pen icon and simply export. The process of theme style import includes choosing the plus icon instead of the pen and then clicking on the import. If you want to export or import your CSS variables, open the Global Classes and Variables Manager, choose Variables from the upper left corner, and then either export or import whichever task you are up to. The same process should be repeated if you are about to export or import global classes. And now the big question, what if your new project requires different spacing or typography values? Well, you're going to go back to the Utopia calculator and generate different CSS variables. You can safely delete the ones you currently use in Bricks Builder, then copy-paste new ones. No need to update global classes because they rely on the CSS variable names. So the only thing you shouldn't do is to change CSS variable names. And that's it, people. I hope it wasn't too boring, and most of all, I hope this tutorial helps you understand global classes, CSS variables, and how to merge everything into a seamless whole named framework. By adopting fluid techniques, you ensure that your website looks great on any device without too much effort and adjustment. Like I said, you can download an entire framework file from a link provided in the description below for a small fee. If you like this tutorial, feel free to subscribe or at least provide a thumb up. Other than that, peace and love.